Okay, so it's been a while since I recorded, so I don't know how well this is going to go, but we'll see. Fantasy romance, romantic fantasy, and romantasy? Yes. These three are very similar, but also different. It can be kind of difficult to understand the differences between them, as well as why you need to know the differences. So that's where this video comes in. I'm gonna break down all of that for you. Hey guys, I'm an aspiring author currently working on my debut novel, temporarily titled Alina. It's a light academia-esque romantic fantasy that surrounds two general races of humanoid winged beings. The main character, Alina, is currently going to school, all while dealing with that, her overbearing parents, meeting a guy that will be the love interest, all while a unknown force is stalking both of them. I hope I explained that correctly. Now, for these three, fantasy, romance, romantic fantasy, and romantasy, the differences are minor, but they are clear differences. So it is a good idea to understand why you need to know the differences before I actually get into the definitions. As a writer, you need to know the differences to better understand your marketing strategy, because the type of story you write will depend on the type of marketing you need to do. If your majority of your story is fantasy, you're gonna want to focus on the fantasy aspects while touching in a little bit on the romance. But if the majority of your story centers around the romance, you want to make sure that you are focusing on that part of the story in a majority of your marketing. Generally, it's just a way of better understanding your story and how to explain it properly to your readers, as well as to your fellow authors. It also helps with finding comp titles. As a reader, it helps you not only find similar stories to something that you like to read, but also better recommend stories to other readers. Now on to the definitions. I feel like this video is going to be very short. Understanding the differences between the three of these is actually easier than you think. Some try to make it way too confusing. I'm just going to break it down in the simplest way possible, because you do not need to know more than this. The way you understand, especially the differences between fantasy, romance, and romantic fantasy, is whatever the second word in the phrase is the majority of the story. So for a fantasy romance, the majority of the story is centered around the romance, and for a romantic fantasy, the majority of the story is centered around the fantasy. The idea of this is if you were to take out the romance from the romantic fantasy, the fantasy story would be able to stand on its own, but the romance story will not be able to stand on its own if you take away the fantasy. So for a fantasy romance, it centers around a romantic story within a fantasy world. For a romantic fantasy, it centers around a fantasy story with a romantic subplot. Now, romantasy is kind of a new genre that has really taken storm, and honestly, I personally really like this genre, and from my understanding of this, because it is still semi-new, my understanding of this genre is that there is an equal level of romance and fantasy, and if you were to take out either the fantasy or the romance, the story could still stand on its own either way. The general idea about these three is that the overall story includes both romance and fantasy, and it's just a matter of it's just a matter of figuring out the nuances of the story that you're writing. Now, this is all well and good, but how do you actually write these stories? So here's a little tip when you're writing these stories. Do not decide in the outlining, plotting, and first draft phase what kind of story you're writing. You do not want to try to conform your story to write a fantasy romance when instead you are writing a romantic fantasy. Now, the two are very similar, but they are different in a way of which plot takes the majority of the story. Which plot takes the main focus of your story. And in the outlining, plotting, first, even second draft phase, you have no idea the actual story that you're writing and the details within the genre itself. So my tip for you is just to write your story that has romance and fantasy. When you are writing this story, it is okay to just tell your readers that you are writing a story that has a mix of fantasy and romance. You do not have to tell them exactly which genre you're writing in. You do not have to be specific in that way. Just mention that you're writing a story that has fantasy and romance, and then you can figure out all the details later. But when it comes to the actual creation of the story, I think you should focus on writing the plot for both the fantasy story and the romance story. Now, when I'm saying fantasy, I mean the plot itself that is different from the romance plot and the romance story structure. There are two story structures that I tend to gravitate towards. The first is the romance story structure, and there is a story structure for building a romance. And the other one is a 3-act structure. I will link a video up in the cards where I go through each plot point of both of these story structures if you're wanting to get into that. When it comes to these two plot lines, you won't know which one will take a center focus until you are done with your second draft. And the reason I say the second draft is because you are constantly shifting and moving things around from the idea phase to the first draft phase. You are constantly shifting things around and deciding what stays and what goes. And even after the second draft, there is a small chance that you will change a large chunk of your story, but it's not extremely likely. But it's also not bad if you have to do that. Wow, this part is very confusing. Generally, you just have to understand that up until you actually hit publish on your novel, you can bounce around between the 3 of these and still figure it out. The key thing that I want to drill into your brains is that throughout the entire writing process, because the 3 of these are so similar, you can change them and bounce around and think that you're writing one and then actually be writing another, and then shift your marketing for that genre up until you actually publish your novel. And even then, you can still shift your genre later on. Everything is changeable. Everything is marketable. Everything is adjustable when you are writing a novel. There are stories that were written in the YA genre and now have been remarketed for the adult genre. So understanding the nuances of the type of fantasy and romance story that you're writing is important, but because they are so similar, it will shift, it will change, it will bounce around between them throughout the entire writing and editing process. So understanding that and knowing that that's okay is key for your mental health and finishing your novel. So don't stress if you are trying to figure out which one you are writing. It is totally fine if you don't know in the first and even second or third draft of your story. And if you are still confused as to what type you are writing, when you get to the professional edit, ask your editors, ask them what they think, which type of fantasy and romance story you're writing. Understanding genres and subgenres and tropes and cliches and all of these things is very confusing, and it will take time, especially if you're a debut author and you have yet to publish. The more you write, the more you'll understand them. So take your time, research them, but all in all, throughout the writing process, it doesn't matter. It really does matter when you're doing the marketing phase, but in the writing and especially the self-editing phase, you don't have to stress about it. You don't have to worry about it. You can figure it out later. Well, that's my video. I have zero idea how long this is going to be, but I'll see you guys later. Happy writing!